The idea of a constitutive instruction order introduces something important and new into modern social thought. Garfinkel and Goffman elaborated the idea with regard to self and mutual intelligibility. The extension of this idea to the social production of meaning in talk and language was accomplished by Harvey Sachs in conjunction with Garfinkel, and formalized by Sachs working with Emanuel Shegloff, Gail Jefferson, and Anita Pomerantz in the famous turn-taking paper, 1974, and other work. Together, they introduced a focus on constitutive orders of action as they relate to the social constitution of self and mutual intelligibility, an approach that intersects with Wittgenstein in essential respects. While it is important to recognize that these arguments build on classical insights, particularly those of Durkheim and Parsons, it is at least equally important to recognize that they break entirely new ground. For instance, while some Goffman's arguments can be seen as elaborations on what Marx and Durkheim might have meant by the claim that the individual is the result of social relations and does not exist unless and until a particular sort of social relation, such as an advanced division of labor, develops, or what Everett Hughes meant by focusing on the details of actual work. The earlier thinkers built on the idea that social institutions set the parameters for everything social. Institutions were posited as setting the beliefs and rules, assuming that these order social life, constraining individuals to orient toward them, more or less. This reliance on institutions is evident even in Durkheim, who was the first to use the term constitutive in arguing for the rising importance of self-regulating practice in modern society. This general confusion of all social order, including constitutive social order with institutional and/or aggregated orders, is one reason why the social tends to be mistakenly identified as contingent. Aggregate orders are contingent. This also explains the popularity of the fallacy of misplaced abstraction. To the extent that social orders are seen as aggregate orders, the social facts involved are contingent, institutional, aggregate, and conceptual. Because there are no constitutive practices in such orders, only conceptual aggregates of individual actions oriented toward institutional norms, accounts, and justifications, there is little constitutive concreteness in the social objects to misplace. Social institutions are conceptual representations of contingent patterns of behavior, described as ordered by rules or customs that develop at a particular time and place because of a combination of local, historical, and individual conditions, while institutions do frame the intelligible character of some of the actions and objects within them, particularly accounts and justifications, conceived of in this way like language or common law. Institutions are the routinized result of the aggregated actions of a great number of individual people acting over time. They are like bell curves. Most of the identities and objects within social institutions, however, are not constituted as social objects by those institutions. They are constituted as social objects by constitutive orders of practice that go on within the walls of social institutions, but which are not defined by those institutions and in fact resist them. Much of the intersubjective character of action and objects within institutional context is constituted by mutual engagement at the level of interaction order. It is a defining characteristic of the idea of institutional or aggregate orders that they could be otherwise. Individuals are taken to exist in some sense independently from social institutions, and social institutions are taken in turn to make demands on individual behavior that can be resisted. This has implications for freedom and creativity and for moral relativity. These demands may take the form of beliefs, traditions, ways of speaking or acting, and rules of action. In all cases, however, it is the defining characteristic of social institutions that these demands are not binding, that people can and do resist and violate these demands. Because social institutions do not actively constitute the social objects within them, enforcement of institutional constraints is a problem that all societies have to deal with. Vocabularies of motive and justification develop within institutional contexts to frame the relationship between actions taken and institutional rules. Each institutional context generates its own particular set, and within that set, each constitutes morality. By contrast, constitutive orders can enforce commitment to themselves because social objects and identities depend on them. This is what it means to say that they are self-regulating. Social institutions cannot self-regulate because objects and mutual intelligibility do not depend on them. In the same way, it is good that they cannot, as social institutions are notoriously inequitable, and their norms are contingent. By contrast, freedom, creativity, and justice, which are often associated with resisting institutional constraints, are made possible by constitutive orders. This relationship between institutions and the vocabularies of justification that develop within them is particularly relevant to the contemporary discussion of morality, since philosophers are currently building on an analysis of justifications as a way of approaching ethics. Justifications belong to social institutions and not to constitutive orders. Actions in constitutive orders do not have justifications. Asking for or making a justification interrupts the practice. The only account that remains within the constitutive interaction order is either to name the practice or a cause that interferes with its performance. I can't see. Furthermore, the working consensus asks people to refrain from asking for justifications. The preference orders work to effect repair without needing to make it explicit. Imagine the question, "Why did you say hello to me?" It will likely be heard as a challenge or insult, not a request for justification. Competent people do not do it, except in exceptional circumstances. The answer might be, "Don't worry, I will not do it again," or "Are you kidding?" but not the immediate production of justification. A competent person might respond to a "hello" from an unrecognized person. "Do I know you?" But this is still not polite. Ordinarily, people just say hello back. When the work of constituting mutually intelligible objects and talk in a constitutive order fails, it is not a failure to comply with norms and therefore cannot be repaired by recourse to naming a justification. It is a failure of competence or commitment and will reflect on the competence and moral character of the person who did it, and possibly of all involved in the encounter, if it is not repaired quickly. The repair work that must be done to manage the mutual constitution of recognizable objects cannot be accomplished through accounts or justifications. As Paul Grice, 1974, pointed out, that approach would involve an infinite regress, each clarification requiring a subsequent clarification. What the constitutive interaction order must achieve to make possible the mutual intelligibility of selves and meanings is an evident order that is constantly mutually confirmed by public displays. This requires a high degree of reciprocity and mutual exchange.